She was a woman who had everything stacked against her, a woman of color arrested by officers known for their blatant racism, unjustly thrown into the system. For them, it was another routine arrest. For her, it was the beginning of something no one could have predicted. In the dimly lit holding cell, she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about the crime they accused her of. It was about a system that had failed her from the start. But what if, just what if, she wasn't the one to be broken by it? What if she rose from the very place they'd tried to bury her? What happens when the victim becomes the one in control? When the very people who once held the power to judge are forced to sit in front of the one person they thought they could crush? This is the true story of a woman who not only faced injustice, but turned the tables in a way that no one could have imagined. A woman who was wronged, but never lost her power. Stay tuned to discover how she became the very thing her oppressors never saw coming, their judge. Welcome to Whispered Dread, where we uncover stories that shake the very foundations of history. Stories that challenge everything we think we know about power, justice, and the human spirit. Today, we're diving into a true, spine-chilling tale, one that reveals how fate and a broken system collided, and how a woman's resolve would make the very forces that sought to destroy her tremble. This isn't just another tale of injustice, it's the story of how an unfair system, built on prejudice, collided head-on with an individual who refused to be silenced. A woman who found herself not just fighting to survive, but to redefine what justice truly means. What starts as a nightmarish ordeal transforms into a haunting turn of events that no one saw coming. This isn't a simple story of revenge. This is a journey of power, transformation, and ultimate justice. You'll witness a plot twist so shocking that it will challenge your perception of how far one person can go to reclaim their dignity. Stay with me as we unravel this tangled web of racial tension, corruption, and personal empowerment. If you're ready for this wild ride, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments below. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. Her name was Imara Lawson, a black woman in a world that tried to tell her who she could be, how far she could go, and how much her voice really mattered. But she was never one to be silenced. A brilliant mind, a fierce spirit, and someone who had spent her life defying the odds. From a young age, she knew what injustice looked like. She saw it in the streets, she read it in the books, and it always gnawed at her. That's why she chose the law, not as a tool of power, but as a weapon for the oppressed. She fought to expose the cracks in a system built on inequality. To her, the law wasn't a shelter, it was a battleground. Her journey wasn't easy. Raised in a community where opportunities for people of color were few, her path to law school was a lonely one. Yet her brilliance, her drive, and her sheer will to succeed carved a path where others saw only walls. She graduated at the top of her class, and soon after she began her legal career. But the legal world, like the streets she grew up on, wasn't kind to black women. It wasn't just the obstacles placed in her way by her colleagues. It was the harsh reality of the system itself. A system that often saw people like her as less than, as expendable. She knew the fight was bigger than her own career. This wasn't just about winning cases, it was about fighting against a system that didn't see her as equal. It was a personal battle, a battle for respect, a battle for recognition in a world that had always looked down on her. It was a time when black Americans were bearing the brunt of racial prejudice in ways that could no longer be ignored. The country was waking up to the injustice faced by people of color, but the truth was the fight was far from over. Police brutality was rampant, racial profiling was a daily reality. And the criminal justice system, well, it wasn't broken, it was built this way, built to subjugate black lives, built to protect the interests of those in power. The very police who were supposed to serve and protect often stood as the embodiment of this system's flaws, treating black individuals as less than human. In this tense environment, she knew the stakes were high, but what she didn't realize was that the most dangerous thing wasn't just the law, it was the prejudice hidden beneath the badges of those sworn to uphold it. And then there were the cops, the officers who would set the stage for this shocking turn of events. They weren't just regular officers, they were infamous in their district. Known for their discriminatory behavior, these men had made a name for themselves in the worst way possible. Their actions were reckless, their attitudes vile. They were the embodiment of the very system that sought to oppress, and their reputation was a black mark on the badge they wore. They had a long history of abusing their power. They harassed black individuals at every turn, knowing full well that their actions would often go unnoticed or unpunished. Their superiority complex was thick, their treatment of black people cruel and degrading. This wasn't just about the law for them, it was about dominance, control, and keeping people in their place. On that fateful day, they weren't expecting anything unusual. For them, arresting a black woman was just another notch on their belt, another routine action in their endless catalogue of abuses. But for the woman they targeted, this wasn't just a case, it was the start of something bigger, something they weren't prepared for. They thought they knew power, but they had no idea that the real power was about to rise from the ashes of their arrogance. It was an ordinary evening, or so it seemed. She was walking down the street, minding her own business. No crime, no wrong. But for these officers, the sight of her was enough to provoke suspicion. They didn't need a reason. It was enough that she was a black woman, alone and on her own path, in a world that had already decided what people like her deserved. They stopped her on the pretext of a minor infraction, a vague accusation, something unimportant in the grand scheme of things, but to them, it was enough to escalate the situation. The situation escalates. What should have been a simple stop turned into a scene of rising tension. The officers began to interrogate her, their voices sharp with suspicion. They accused her of loitering, of acting suspiciously, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. Their words were filled with condescension and disdain, their body language aggressive. One officer stepped too close, his breath heavy with authority, as if daring her to make a move. The ugliness of racism was on full display that night. Their questions grew more pointed, their accusations more outlandish. They called her disrespectful, told her to know her place. They used every slur they could muster, seeking to strip away her dignity with each word. The more she kept her composure, the more they sought to break her. They tried to provoke her, trying to get a reaction, to make her the problem. Their taunts grew louder, their insults sharper. Yet she remained silent, refusing to give them what they wanted. One officer called her a troublemaker. Another muttered something about uppity women who think they can challenge authority. It was a game to them, a game in which they held all the power, but they underestimated her. She could feel the walls closing in, but she refused to show fear, refused to let them see the anger boiling inside her. But no matter how calm she stayed, it didn't matter. Their decision had already been made. The charges were fabricated, the arrest entirely unjust. Without warning, they threw handcuffs around her wrists, the cold metal biting into her skin. "You're under arrest," one of the officers sneered. The words echoed in her mind like a cruel joke. She wasn't the criminal, they were. But the system was blind to that, and she was dragged into the back of their patrol car. They took her in, not because she had committed a crime, but because they had the power to do so. In the cold, sterile confines of the jail cell, the full weight of the injustice settled in. She stared at the walls, her mind racing. She had spent her career fighting to uphold the very laws that now had been turned against her. The irony of it all struck her like a heavy blow. The legal system, which she had once believed in with all her heart, was now the very thing holding her prisoner. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Every hour felt like an eternity. The noise of the jail was deafening, the clanging of metal doors, the shouts from other inmates, the hum of fluorescent lights. But in her mind, it was eerily quiet. She was alone in her thoughts. She couldn't help but wonder how many others had faced this same nightmare before her. How many had been swallowed whole by the very system that was supposed to protect them. She could feel the rage building inside her, not at the officers, they were nothing but puppets of the system, but at the system itself. She had spent so much of her life working to change it, only to be caught in its grip. How had she not seen it coming? Or had she seen it and just not believed it was possible? The question gnawed at her. She had worked so hard, she had fought so many battles, but none of that mattered now. All that mattered was that the system had wronged her, and in this moment it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. As she sat in that cold cell, a dark realization began to take shape. This wasn't just about her, this was bigger. The officers who arrested her, they were only part of the problem. The real enemy was a system that had been built to dehumanize and oppress, and maybe, just maybe, she was the one who could finally stand up to it. It was in that lonely, desolate place that she made a decision. She wouldn't let this moment define her. She wouldn't let the system win. She would fight, not just to clear her name, but to change everything. And when the time came, she would make them pay for what they had done, not with violence, but with justice, a justice they would never see coming. But here's where the story takes an unimaginable turn. The woman who had been wrongfully arrested, humiliated, and stripped of her dignity wasn't defeated. She was transformed. Years later, the woman who once found herself helpless in the grip of a broken system would, in a twist of fate, find herself in the one position where she could make the system answer for itself. This time, she wasn't the one on trial. She was the one deciding the fate of those who had tried to break her. It wasn't just that she wanted to clear her name. No, she wasn't just looking for vindication. She was aiming higher, much higher. She was going to do what no one expected. She was going to take control of her own destiny and show those who thought they had won that the last word had not yet been spoken. The road to this moment wasn't easy. After being released from jail, she didn't retreat into the shadows of shame. Instead, she channeled her anger and hurt into action. She knew that in order to expose the truth, she had to fight back in the only place that mattered, the courtroom. But the legal battle wasn't going to be easy. The officers who had arrested her were well connected, and the system had long turned a blind eye to their misconduct. She had to build her case carefully, presenting evidence that was meticulously gathered, witness testimonies, documentation, and even the dark history of the officers involved. It wasn't just about proving her innocence, it was about exposing the pattern of corruption and racism that ran deep through the very institutions that were supposed to protect the public. Her case, against all odds, gained widespread attention. The media took notice. Activists rallied behind her. Her story became a symbol of everything wrong with a system that was supposed to ensure justice, but often failed those who needed it most. Her fight became a beacon of hope for others who had suffered in silence, and slowly her resolve and courage began to win the respect of even her harshest critics. It was during this time that she realized something. This fight was no longer just about her. It was about everyone who had been wronged by the system. It was about creating a ripple of change that would go far beyond this case. And as she watched her case unfold, she knew one thing: the officers who had once tried to crush her would soon have to answer to someone who understood the truth better than anyone else. Her victory in the courtroom wasn't just about legal triumph, it was a battle won for every voice that had been silenced. But she wasn't finished. Her destiny, her true calling, was far from over. She hadn't just fought the system, she had begun to reshape it. The woman who once feared being powerless in the face of authority was now a force in her own right. She wasn't just a lawyer, she was an embodiment of the kind of justice the world needed. The fire that had been lit in her heart had only grown stronger with time. Her career flourished, and with each passing year, she became a towering figure in the legal community. She took on cases that others were too afraid to touch, and she won them. She used her experience, the pain, the humiliation, the injustice, as a powerful motivator to drive her work. Her reputation grew, not just as a skilled attorney, but as someone who wasn't afraid to hold the system accountable. It wasn't long before the unthinkable happened. She was appointed to the bench. A black woman, once the victim of a corrupt system, now stood at its pinnacle, poised to change everything. Years after the arrest, against all odds, she became a judge, a position that, for most, would have been a crowning achievement in a career. But for her, it was something much more profound. It wasn't just a promotion, it was a declaration of war against the system that had once tried to bury her. And then came the moment that would change everything. The very officers who had once cuffed her hands dragged her through the mud and tried to silence her. They found themselves seated in her courtroom. The same men who had looked down on her, judged her based on the color of her skin, now sat in front of her, their fates in her hands. They had no idea what was coming. They thought they had silenced her once and for all. But now the tables had turned. She was no longer the one who was powerless. She was the one who had all the power. The day had arrived. The very officers who had once dragged her into a cold, dark cell were now the ones standing in front of her, their eyes wide with disbelief. The power dynamic had shifted, and they could feel it in the air. They didn't recognize the woman who walked into the courtroom. No longer the young, frightened woman they had once arrested, she now stood behind the judge's bench, a figure of authority they could never have imagined her becoming. Her eyes locked onto theirs, and for the first time they saw her not as a victim, but as the force that would bring them to justice. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. The sound of the gavel slamming down echoed in the silence as she took her seat, her presence filling every corner of the room. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado now replaced with unease. They were used to being the ones in control, used to people like her quivering in fear when they walked into a room. But now, as they stood there in front of her, the tables had turned in a way that none of them could have prepared for. Their faces flushed with confusion, a few exchanged nervous glances, realizing too late that they were now the ones being judged. They had done everything in their power to humiliate her, to break her spirit, but now they were forced to confront the consequences of their actions. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in that room, especially not on her. The people who once sought to silence her were now silenced by the very system they had manipulated, and the woman who had once been powerless was now their worst nightmare. As she looked down at them, her voice unwavering, she made it clear there would be no favoritism in this courtroom. No bias would cloud her judgment. No title or badge would protect them from the law. They would be judged not by who they were or the positions they held, but by their actions. The gavel fell again, and the room held its breath. The world they knew, the one where they could do no wrong, was crumbling before them. She turned to the evidence, methodically laying out the facts of the case, the witnesses, the documents, the countless records of their misconduct. The officers who had once walked with impunity now had to face the cold truth of their actions. It was no longer about her personal pain. It was about justice, real justice, a justice that would hold them accountable for the lives they had ruined. The climax of the story came not with a thunderous speech or a dramatic flourish, but in the quiet, decisive weight of her judgment. With a single stroke of the gavel, she declared her ruling. The officers were guilty. They had abused their power. They had wronged her, and they had wronged countless others. Their actions were a violation not just of the law, but of the very oath they had sworn to uphold. The room fell into a stunned silence. The officers stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. They had expected a slap on the wrist, maybe a reprimand. But instead they were faced with the full force of the law. The law that they had thought was their ally had become the weapon they could no longer escape. Her ruling didn't just change the lives of those officers, it changed everything. The message she sent reverberated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. It wasn't just about what she had done to them, it was about what she had done for the countless others who had been silenced, oppressed, or ignored. For once, the scales of justice were balanced. The officers were held accountable, their badges stripped, their careers destroyed. The very system that had once failed her was now the system that brought them down, and the people who had once turned a blind eye to the abuses of power were now forced to confront the truth. But the real power of her decision lay in the message it sent. It wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about restoring faith in a system that had long been broken. It was a testament to the idea that no one is above the law, no matter their station. That no matter how much power they wield, justice would always find a way to rise. And for the woman who had been wronged, this wasn't just a victory, it was the moment she had been fighting for her entire life. She had taken back her power, she had reclaimed her dignity, and she had changed the course of justice forever. The consequences for the officers who once held all the power were swift and undeniable. Their once untouchable status crumbled in the wake of the ruling. They lost everything, careers, respect, and their place within the very system they had tried to control. Their actions, long buried under the weight of their badges, were finally brought into the light. The officers were charged with misconduct, their badges stripped away, and they were faced with the consequences of their years of abuse. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a complete dismantling of their careers, a stark reminder that no one is above the law. The fear they had once instilled in others was now a shadow they had to live with for the rest of their lives. They were no longer the hunters, they were the hunted. But the true impact wasn't on the officers, it was on the world around her. She didn't just reclaim her own dignity. She sparked a revolution, a movement of change in a world too often plagued by inequality. Her story became a beacon of hope for those who felt voiceless, for those who had suffered in silence. She wasn't just a victim of the system, she was the embodiment of its potential to change. Her victory was more than just personal, it was collective. People began to look at her as a symbol of what could be accomplished when one person stood up against a broken system. Her rise from victim to judge inspired countless others to believe that they too could fight for what was right. She showed them that no matter how deep the corruption, no matter how entrenched the injustices, change could still come, one person at a time. Her influence spread far beyond the courtroom. Her story became a rallying cry, a reminder that the fight for justice doesn't end when you are knocked down. It ends when you stand back up, stronger and more determined. Her example fueled the flames of movements across the country, inspiring lawyers, activists, and everyday citizens to challenge the status quo. Her story is a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the unshakable belief that even in a broken system, one person can change everything. She showed us that the path to justice isn't always easy. Sometimes it takes fighting through unimaginable odds, facing down the very forces that would break you, and refusing to give in. She didn't just want justice for herself, she wanted justice for all. This story proves that power isn't always where we expect it to be. It doesn't always lie in the hands of the authorities or the people in the highest positions. Sometimes it's in the hands of someone who is willing to risk everything for what is right. And though her story may have started with injustice, it ended as a triumph, showing the world that no matter how dark the system becomes, one person can shine the light that leads to change. So what do you think? Did the cops truly receive the justice they deserved? Was it enough, or do you think the consequences didn't go far enough? This story raises so many questions about accountability, power, and the law. I want to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in her shoes? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. If this story struck a chord with you, if it inspired you or made you think differently about justice and resilience, hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe, because there are more stories just like this one coming your way. Trust me, you won't want to miss them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time with another story that'll leave you stunned, inspired, and questioning the world around you.